to another episode of the Encores Club with your co-host, Velvet Rebel, and from Daily Durante, Rhonda. How you doing today, Rhonda?
Good. How are you?
I am fantastic. It's been a little while. Summer was crazy. We got away, but there's almost a backlog of albums, so there's a lot for us to catch up on. So I'm super excited about that. How about you?
You know what? I took a break, and I admittedly did not do my homework for many months, and so here I am back, and I'm trying to get back into the swing of things, just like my kid is. So we're doing great.
All right, well, we're coming out guns blazing with some straight up rock and roll. One of the 80s legendary bands on MTV, of course, Night Ranger. Their new album is called And the Band Played On, or ATBPO. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm going with And the Band Played On. Here's a little taste of the new Night Ranger. It doesn't matter to me tonight. That was a little taste of And the Band Played On, the latest album from Night Ranger, still featuring the dual vocals, the legend Jack Blades, as well as Kelly Keagy. The dual guitar attack is still there with Brad Gillis and a newer arrival, Carrie Kelly. It's exactly what you want from Night Ranger. It's hard rock, it's melodic metal, with the obligatory power ballad, of course. I really enjoyed this. For me, Night Ranger was a band very aware of in the 80s. Don't think I ever owned any of the albums, but you definitely knew all the singles. Of course, Sister Christian was the most obvious of them. But pleasantly surprised how well this album comes across. I thought it was one of the better rock albums I've heard in recent years. Rhonda, what was your first impression?
I honestly, I don't know a lot about Night Ranger. They were not a band that was on my radar back in the 80s, although, of course, I knew Sister Christian. And so for me, I was really shocked because to me, they sounded as much hair band as anything else I ever listened to back then. I mean, they're very power ballad, guitar driven, lots of that. I will say I thought it was a pretty versatile album because I mean they go from it being that power ballad to like almost not country, but more of a contemporary type of country that you would hear on where I live. It's K-Jug radio here, and you would hear it on there for sure. So I was surprised by that. It is very 80s. I felt it was very lyrically simple, easy to understand. The song structure is not out of this, world crazy. It's just your basic rock, and I liked that a lot. I could tell though it was a Frontier record right away.
Oh yeah.
Because I think that they hone that and they own that space, and so that's kind of fun. I think it's exactly what I would have expected. I have to admit, overall, I was a little underwhelmed by it because there was no surprises for me whatsoever, other than it being pretty hair band up front. But after that, no, it was exactly what I would have expected, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's interesting. As I was listening to it, it's like, where does Night Ranger sit in that rock and roll history from the 80s? Because they weren't marketed as a Bon Jovi or a Poison, but musically there was a lot of similarities. Of course, Jack Blades went and did Damn Yankees, which was one of my favorite super groups. Them and Bad English are just awesome albums in the 80s. So I think they could have gone that direction because musically they had the chops, but that dual guitar attack, there's moments where I'm like, oh, Judas Priest would probably love this song. So they're very versatile as a band. For fans of Sister Christian, I mean, if that's the song you love by them, for me, The Hardest Road would be the closest one. I thought that song was very similar. And, it's funny, and that we've talked about this on the show, I kind of don't like positive, hopeful lyrics. I tend to go for the darker stuff. But when it comes to this kind of rock and roll, I'm like, lighter out, I'm holding up, I'm like, yeah, let's come together. And it's like, it got me excited about that stuff. A couple songs I really liked was Dance, kind of opens with a We Will Rock You vibe, and really takes off from there. And, Bring It All Home to Me, which I believe is one of the singles. You can hear the keyboards in it. And maybe that's why they weren't being pushed in the same direction as some of those other metal bands in the 80s, because they weren't afraid of melody and they weren't afraid of using keyboards. They were a band that wanted to write great songs. So, now that we're talking, the band that comes to mind is, they were almost like an extension of Journey in the 80s, a band that can just play rock and fill an arena. Maybe they never hit those heights commercially, but I mean, the music's there. I mean, there's a lot of great songs on this album.
Yeah, it's interesting how, as much as I don't know about them from the 80s, I have to agree, they'd easily fit into that, into that area or space. So I'm surprised that they really didn't. But I think it is what you said, in the 80s, if you had keyboards, they wanted to relegate you to electronic, to the same sort of stuff, same space as Duran Duran, and they don't fit anywhere near that. So I think that they must have had a difficult time trying to market their music back then. Although I certainly remember listening to Sister Christian on the radio.
Yeah.
But honestly, that's probably one of the only songs by them that I could pick out that I know I heard over and over again.
I remember
But
we can you can still rock in America. I remember that video on MTV
yeah,
pretty clearly. I think they were playing on train tracks actually during it, but yeah,
maybe,
beyond that, they're kind of like Loverboy, where you remember a couple
yeah,
songs, and
like
but I listen to this album and listen to how good they are as musicians. I think they deserve a little more credit, and they're going to do fine. I'm sure they can go play the fair circuit and all those different things. But this is a band that they deserve a bigger audience. And as these bands get back on the road, I hope maybe they can do a package tour with a few other rock bands from the '80s. But this album alone needs to be heard by some people. And these bands from the '80s who are just straight up rock bands are making great music today. And I just hope people are a little more open to that. It seems like once a band gets older, we just kind of resist it. But these guys are still making some great rock and roll.
Yeah, for sure. It's just, I think right now it's just really tough getting your music heard. There's no way to do it other than, Spotify and, Apple Music and hoping it gets streamed,
Yeah.
which is a bummer because bands like this, they deserve to be heard live for sure. So it'd be nice if we could get back out there.
Yeah, if you're a fan of '80s rock, even if you haven't known Night Ranger over the years, this is an album worth picking up. It's on Frontiers. Give it a shot. If you like melodic pop rock, this is a great, great rock and roll record. So enjoy. Which brings us to our next album. What are we talking about today?
Okay. All right. So this week we are talking Pressure Machine, which is album number 7 from the Killers. Yay! And that is exciting to me because they are one of my favorite bands. And this particular album features 3 out of the 4 original members. Dave Kooning came back this time to play guitar. The album itself is a conceptual retrospect of Nephi, Utah. It's a small, small town, and that's the childhood home of Brandon Flowers. And I'm going to give you a little taster of it right now. I'm in the car, I just needed to clear my head. All right, so that was the Killers, their brand new album, Pressure Machine. Musically, the album is a complete departure from their classic Killers, and the album is said to be heavily influenced by Bruce Springsteen and is supposed to be overall a quieter and less electronic album than others in their catalog. But I am the Killers fan. Jason, you're not as much, so I cannot wait to hear what you have to say.
I do love Hot Fuss, and I still go back to that record. Mr. Brightside is one of the greatest anthems of the last 25 years. I thought of a better name for this than Pressure Machine. I think it should be called Hillbilly Heroin Pills, the Mormon Opioid Rock Opera. You said it's influenced by Springsteen. As far as I can tell, it's just almost it's a rewrite of Nebraska. I mean, as a huge Springsteen fan, Nebraska is my favorite Springsteen album. I see what Brandon's doing here. I've lost track of which members of the Killers are back for which records at this point. Imploding the Mirage, I thought was a very good rock album. I enjoyed it. And this is about as bonkers as one would expect from Brandon. But surprisingly, it's not horrible. He wins me over. If anything, I think my biggest issue with this, compared to like when Springsteen was writing Nebraska, he was in his late 20s, early 30s. Brandon's 40 now. He's looking back over a lot more years, and I think that clouds maybe how we view some of these characters in the story. So that was kind of my squiggle with the album. But on paper, I should dislike this a lot more than I do.
Sure.
It is very much like Nebraska. I mean, some of the character sketches I could relate directly to to Springsteen songs. But at the end of the day, I think whatever he's doing here, this Mormon opioid rock opera actually works.
Oh my God. All right, here we go. Okay, so I will admit up front, I am really not a Springsteen fan. I am far more a fan of Springsteen's fandom, like his fan community, than I am of him. Um, and so that said, I don't know a lot about him really. And for me, they could have said that this album was influenced by just about anyone, and I would have said, okay. I hear more Johnny Cash than I do Springsteen, to be fair. I will start by saying this: the Killers are a band that are really supposed to be as glam and glitter as Vegas, but they want to be as American as Nebraska. And I just don't think that they can get to the point where the rhinestones and the sequins aren't catching that light. And that's how I feel about it. Um, there's, you know, I felt like it's a little bit too retrospective. It's just like what you said. Brandon spends a lot of time talking about the opioid issues, about just these huge things. Um, about suicide, and not just suicide, but suicide because the community can't accept the way a kid is. Um, they talk I mean, and he talks a lot about drugs on this album.
Yep.
I'm shocked at how much it just keeps coming back to opioids. I'm like, my God, could it be any more depressing? And it is. But then the unabridged version, which is the version where there's like speaking in the back, in the background for every single song, or just before every single song. It's trying to tell a story of what it's like to live in a small town, and yet a lot of the stories that they say, that they're talking about, don't really match with the songs in which they're talking about. And I didn't like that a lot. I felt like the album was almost a Brandon Flowers solo album more than it was the Killers. And so then I started listening to it thinking, okay, well, what are some hallmarks that I can pick out that are genuinely the Killers? And there's remarkably few. I mean, there are some songs on there. In the Car Outside, I think, is much more traditionally Killers. I also think that In Another Life is a little bit more. But there's just some really dark stuff going on here. And in this point in my life, I needed a little bit more light. I don't know. I wouldn't say it was done well. I think it was done okay. I think it's going to be one of these albums very similarly to Sam's Town, that fans are either going to jump on board and be like, yes, this is exactly what I want, or they're going to be more like me and say, it's okay, but I'm looking forward to whatever's next. And I am looking forward to whatever's next, because they've already announced that they're coming out with album number 8, and it's supposed to be traditional Killers. So I'm crossing my fingers and hoping for that.
Remember, Springsteen followed Nebraska with "Born in the USA," and commercially that worked out okay for him. So,
Yeah.
and that kind of established that anthem Springsteen motif again. So, for me, it's just he's so committed to it that he wins me over. He's so earnest in everything he does. And I believe he's very honest lyrically in how he wants to paint these characters. It's just I don't know if that's his strength. I mean, the one song, which, I mean, a lot of the songs I'm like, okay, they're not terrible, but he opens with Coca-Cola Grin, Honeysuckle Skin. When Springsteen opens Atlantic City with They Blew Up the Chicken Man in Philly last night, I'm like, who's the chicken man? What happened? Like, I'm immediately engaged. Or Nebraska, which is, about serial killer, goes across the state killing people with his girlfriend. I think he's picking the characters and sketching them in a way that it's just not as interesting. Cody, who he's the small town bully, doesn't like religion. I mean, it's kind of a stereotype in itself, but he's at a stage in his life where to me it's not that interesting. And everyone says they're waiting on a miracle in that song, but everyone's static. And to me it's more interesting when things actually happen. What happens when this Cody character falls in love, and that reminds me of Springsteen's song called "Counting on a Miracle," or what happens when he goes on that murder spree like the guy does in Nebraska. But just being a small town bully who doesn't like religion, I'm like, okay, so that's someone you knew in Utah, but what about it? Why should we care? Like, to me, that jump is just not there with this album. But I like the way it's recorded. I'm just really excited to see what Killers fans think of this, because I think he's really pushing them outside their comfort zone. for me, I got into Springsteen and that Nebraska album through Cowboy Junkies. They did some covers off that album that I loved and drew me in. And if this sends some people to Nebraska, even better, because that's a side of Springsteen a lot of people might not know, especially a younger Killers generation. You mentioned The Car Outside. That's my favorite track by far. It's probably, for me, the one that's the most like the Killers you expect. But at the end of the day, I think he pulls it off. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of people that absolutely hate this album and some that absolutely love it. It's definitely a concept album about any town USA, but I think with the spoken word interludes, he's trying to make it so specific that that whole ability to just be any small town is kind of lost.
I agree.
So, maybe he just pushed it too far. But at the end of the day, kudos to Brandon for trying this. I think, it shows some courage.
I agree. I think that the storytelling, I I really believe in my heart that Brandon is an excellent storyteller. But, and this is a big but, I think this album where it loses me as a concept album is that there is no real story. It's a bunch of vignettes put together. And I love short stories, but when you're trying to put a whole bunch of different stories into an album without really connecting the dots, it's tough. It's a tough sell. And I think that at musically, which is really key here, it's done well. I mean, I think the production is excellent on it. I think that the songwriting itself is very nice. And if you take each song by itself, you know, I think in some ways, for some fans, it's going to be a watershed moment. But I think that overall, if you're trying to appeal, and I'm pretty sure that the band was not trying to appeal to the larger, I don't see this going to radio. I think that this was something, it was a passion project for them that they did during the time of the pandemic. And I think if you take it like that, then it's not a disappointment. But I think that if you're looking for them to, for this to be a mainstream type album, no, I don't think it's there. And that's okay. Not every album needs to be a top hit. So,
And they have Imploding the Mirage already ready to go on the tour. So, they just have this downtime and, I think it's a very interesting project. And, I came in wanting to rip it apart just because it was so much like Nebraska. But at the end of the day, I like what it aspires to be. I don't think it hits the mark completely, but kudos to the killer. So, yeah. So if you're watching, tell us what you think of this one. I know there's a lot of Killers fans that we talk to online, so very curious what your take is on this. And as always, thank you for joining us on the Encores Club. Somewhere on this YouTube thing, there's a subscribe button. We would love it if you subscribed. We got a lot of new episodes coming up. There's a lot of music from the summer we're catching up on, so stay tuned for more of that. On behalf of Rhonda and I, thank you as always for joining the Encores Club.
Bye.